Welcome to the Maritime Museum of Denmark. I'm standing in the exhibition OCEANISTA, Fashion and the Sea, which explores how fashion has been inspired by and sometimes even stolen from seafaring. The theme Under the Skin looks at tattoos and sailor symbols. We have the Margiela top, inspired by tattoos, and then we also have actual tattooed sailor skin. The sailor stripes are perhaps the most recognizable inspiration from seafaring in fashion, and a designer such as Jean-Paul Gaultier has it as part of his design DNA. Naval uniforms are a huge source of inspiration for fashion. Tom Brown is one example, and he uses uniforms as a way of challenging gender norms. Fashion is inspired by the sea, but also looks to the sea for new, more sustainable materials. Examples could be seaweed and salmon skin. The ocean is also a mysterious place filled with all kinds of creatures. This is something that Iris van Herpen has interpreted in her dress inspired by sea serpents. Iris van Herpen celebrates the delicacy of water in one of its lightest forms as a bubble, and she has created this dress out of 1,000 hand-blown bubbles. The ocean is also a powerful force, something to be feared, and this is something that Craig Green with Montclair has interpreted in the shape of a lifeboat. Ropes and knots are also a huge part of seafaring and in fashion. To create an immersive experience with OCEANISTA, Fashion and the Sea, scenographer Julian Julin has created an underwater landscape with corals. Light and film are very important components for creating life in this underwater landscape.
So sailor clothing is very much a fantasy, but it's also very much reality. And a lot of people, they have this quite singular idea of what sailor clothing is, but reality is that it's very, very diverse. And what we're trying to do in the exhibition is that we want to show this diversity and show that sailor's clothing is for a lot of different occasions and for a lot of different people and from a lot of different cultures. So it's just not one thing. It's like a plethora of different things. And what we're trying to do with the exhibition is that we try to show the reality. We know that it's not the whole reality, but it's our version of reality, and notably that version of the reality that has shown itself to be inspiration for designers through the years. During the War of American Liberation, there was a small naval battle, a skirmish rather, between a British and a French ship. 30 French sailors, they died, but the French, they won the skirmish. And those sailors, and this episode became like, there was this national wave that they hit Paris. And one of the symbols of this battle and a way to commemorate the brave sailors that was wearing hats in the shape of this naval ship. And suddenly you saw the rich ladies of Paris with these huge hats depicting ships. And it's something we see in this hat behind me, made by the designer Philip Tracy. One of the most iconic things for the sailor, that's the collar. And as we see behind me, this collar, this square collar, it's maybe not the most practical item, but it's been a symbol for especially the Royal Navy, the British Navy, from the 19th century onwards. And it's actually quite interesting because the sailor, if you go back to maybe the 17th or 18th century, the sailor was perceived as a bit of a rugged, rogue, quite repulsive character. But then through the 19th century, the sailor develops into this national icon. And where before he was perceived as unkempt, then in the 19th century he suddenly becomes extremely well groomed, and this idea of the sailor clothing transcends into children's clothing, because the sailor suddenly becomes a role model, which he wasn't before, and then also into women's fashion. the different nations' navies, they have different symbols. We have the Dixie cup from the American Navy, and we have the color from the British Navy. And then, of course, we have the stripes from the French Navy. Originally, actually, the first navy to introduce the stripes, that was the Russian Navy, but it has been forgotten. And now it's the French Navy and French fishermen that you connect mentally when you see the stripes. And of course, you also connect the stripes with Jean Paul Gaultier and Chanel and other designers that took those stripes that are iconic and turned them into clothes for everyone. For many years, sailors, they didn't have uniforms. Actually, in the merchant navy, uniforms didn't really appear until the 1970s, and maybe you can't really speak about uniforms in the merchant navy still, apart from the officers, of course. The officers on board the naval ships, on board the merchant ships, they've had uniforms for centuries. But the ironic thing is that you call them uniforms, but they weren't actually uniform. They differed quite a lot from person to person, because they were more a symbol of the officer's class in society than his rank on board the ship. But then, during the 19th century, a development came where the uniforms became standardized and actually uniform. Our exhibition doesn't just deal with fashion inspired by sailors' clothing, but fashion inspired by the sea and the maritime themes in general. And one of the exciting maritime themes, I think, is the dazzle painting of the First World War. And dazzle painting, of course, as the word implies, means something that will dazzle you, something that will maybe confuse you a bit. And dazzle painting was made on the merchant ships and also some naval ships during the First World War, to confuse the enemy. So it's not camouflage, because it's not meant to conceal the ship, but it's meant to confuse the enemy, so they can't really see which course, which speed, and maybe even the shape of the ship. So that's something it inspired the fashion designers, but also artists, because you had these warships with guns everywhere, with the speed, with the death and the destruction, and all this horror that was also fascinating to a lot of people. And as seen after quite a lot of wars, the naval heroes, they were heroes during the war, but especially after the war, when they became idols, and their clothing and their world inspired fashion. And we see that with the dazzle painting as well. The sailor is, apart from being a working man, he's also a sex symbol for men and women alike. And it's one of the reasons that the sailor is such a sex symbol, apart from him being brave and strong. It's also that he's unbound. He comes to your harbor, maybe your port, and you see him, and you know that he will disappear again. And also remember that some of these naval ships, there's maybe 500 or thousands or 1,500 sailors on board, and when they come into your town, into your city, all dressed in your fancy uniforms, suddenly there's handsome young guys everywhere, and it's something that inspires the fashionistas a lot, and we see that behind me. Knitting is an integral part of the sailor's clothing, because wool, even though it gets wet, it's still quite warm. And you see different knitting traditions all over Scandinavia and the British Isles and the North Atlantic, and we deal quite a lot with that in the exhibition, because it's a subject well known and also performed by a lot of our visitors, and it's something that a lot of people, when they think of sailors, and notably fishermen, which is also a kind of sailor, they think of the knitting, and a lot of the different patterns, they symbolize different things, or so people say they do, at least. So it's something that will, when you're wearing an old sailor's knitted sweater, you, apart from being warm, you also connect yourself with the roots of our culture.